In the summer of 1944, the skies above the Balkans were among the most dangerous in the world. American bomber crews flying out of bases in southern Italy were threading their aircraft through walls of anti-aircraft fire and enemy interceptors on missions that took them deep into Axis-controlled territory, past the mountains of Yugoslavia, north into Hungary, east toward the refineries of Romania. The target that preoccupied Allied strategic planners more than almost any other was the oil complex at Ploiești, a sprawling industrial cathedral of petroleum infrastructure in the Romanian lowlands that supplied Nazi Germany with roughly a third of all the fuel its armies and air fleets consumed. Without Ploiești, the Wehrmacht's tanks would slow, its aircraft would be grounded, and the war machine that had swallowed a continent would begin to choke. With it, Germany could continue fighting. The logic was as simple and brutal as that, and so the missions continued, wave after wave of B-17s and B-24s lifting off from the airfields at Foggia and Brindisi, climbing to altitude, forming up in their tight defensive boxes, and flying northeast into the furnace. Between October 1943 and the autumn of 1944, the United States 15th Air Force flew more than 20,000 sorties over this region. The mathematics of aerial warfare over heavily defended targets are, at their core, mathematics of attrition. Flak tore through aluminum skin. German fighters vectored in from altitude. Engines caught fire. Hydraulic lines ruptured. Wings buckled. By the time the campaign over Ploiești and surrounding industrial targets was deepening in intensity, estimates suggested that roughly half of the aircraft that entered certain defended zones over Yugoslavia did not return intact. Many crews died in their aircraft or on impact with the earth below, but many did not. Many found themselves tumbling out of stricken bombers at altitude, parachutes opening over alien terrain, drifting down into the forested mountains and river valleys of a country they had only ever seen as a patchwork of colored map segments. They landed in occupied Yugoslavia, and what happened to them next is one of the most extraordinary and largely untold stories of the Second World War. What those airmen found when they reached the ground was not, as they might have feared, immediate capture or death. What they found in village after village across the mountains and valleys of central Serbia were ordinary people, farmers, shepherds, priests, school teachers, grandmothers, who took enormous personal risk to hide them, feed them, provide them with peasant clothing, and move them through networks of informal protection away from German patrols. The penalty for harboring Allied airmen in German-occupied Serbia was not imprisonment. It was execution, often on the spot, often extended to the families of those who helped. Every loaf of bread handed to a downed American flyer was handed in the shadow of that knowledge, and yet the sheltering continued, expanding with each passing week as the number of downed airmen grew. By the spring of 1944, there were not a handful of American airmen hiding in the Serbian countryside. There were dozens, and by midsummer, there were hundreds. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow and keeps stories like this alive. All right, let's get back to it. The military force responsible for organizing and protecting these men was the Chetnik movement, the royalist guerrilla army of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, loyal to the government in exile in London and commanded by General Draguleb Mihailović, known to his men and his people simply as Draja. Mihailović was a complicated figure even within the war itself, a Serbian nationalist, a monarchist, a man navigating an almost impossibly treacherous political landscape where he faced German occupiers, Croatian fascist militias, and the communist partisan movement led by Josip Broz Tito simultaneously. Allied support, particularly British support, had been shifting steadily toward Tito throughout 1943 and into 1944, driven by the assessment that the partisans were more effective fighters and by the influence of British intelligence officers embedded with both movements. By the time American airmen were beginning to accumulate in the Serbian hills in significant numbers, Mihailovich was effectively abandoned by Churchill's government. He was receiving no supplies, no Allied liaison officers, and no recognition. He was, in the eyes of the dominant Allied power in the Mediterranean theater, already a relic of a policy that had been discarded. Despite this, he made a decision. The American airmen under his protection would be sheltered, cared for, and returned to Allied hands. Whatever the political calculations swirling around him, whatever the pressure being applied from all directions, this he would not abandon. He issued orders to his commanders across the region. The Americans were to be treated as honored guests. Any harm that came to them under Chetnik protection would be answered severely. His forces organized the downed airmen into encampments, rotated them between safe locations as German search operations intensified, ensured they received food from communities that had very little to spare, and arranged medical care for those wounded in their crashes or bailouts. In a country where a single informer could bring a column of German soldiers down on a village within hours, hundreds of young American airmen in flight suits were being kept alive through a combination of local courage, organizational discipline, and the force of one man's determined word. Word of their situation reached the outside world through one of those quiet pivots that large histories sometimes turn on unexpectedly. Mirjana Vujović was a young Yugoslav woman working at her country's embassy in Washington when she heard, through fragmented reports and personal contacts, that American airmen were being sheltered behind enemy lines in Serbia in growing numbers. She wrote to her husband, George, a Yugoslav American who had received a commission in the United States Army and was then working for the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's wartime intelligence and clandestine operations agency, stationed in Bari in southern Italy. Her letter was a simple human communication. "There are hundreds of men there," it said. "Can you do something? Can you get them out?" George Vujović could, and he would. He began drafting a rescue operation. The concept was in some respects straightforward, in others almost fantastically ambitious. The plan called for an OSS team to parachute into Chetnik territory, link up with Mihailović's forces, locate and consolidate the scattered airmen, and construct a landing strip somewhere in the occupied Serbian countryside capable of receiving transport aircraft. Those aircraft would then fly in from Italy, land in the dark, load the airmen aboard, and fly them back to Allied territory. Every element of this plan presented its own category of difficulty. The OSS team would be operating in German-occupied territory with no meaningful support infrastructure. The airfield would need to be built by hand, in secret, in a location where German ground forces were actively searching for the missing American flyers. The transport flights would need to navigate without the benefit of radar guidance, land on an improvised strip, and depart before German forces could respond. And the entire apparatus depended on the cooperation of a guerrilla commander whom the British had already effectively written off, and whom significant elements of the Allied intelligence establishment regarded with varying degrees of suspicion. The political friction surrounding the mission was immediate and corrosive. Britain maintained that Yugoslavia fell within its sphere of operational influence, and British military and intelligence channels had been working methodically to transfer all Allied engagement in the country to Tito's partisans. When the Americans began organizing their extraction operation, British opposition surfaced at multiple levels. Early attempts to infiltrate the OSS team into Chetnik territory using British aircraft were plagued by what the Americans came to regard as deliberate miscoordination: wrong coordinates, wrong flight paths, aircraft that seemed to end up over partisan-held rather than Chetnik-held territory. Lieutenant George Musalin, the OSS officer tapped to lead the ground team, was a man of Serbian descent who had previously spent time embedded with Mihailovic's forces. He had watched the political abandonment of the Chetniks with growing frustration. When it became clear that the British routing of the insertion flights was compromising the mission before it had even begun, he demanded that an American aircraft and an American crew be used. The demand was eventually granted. On the night of August 2, 1944, 3 men dropped through darkness over the mountains of occupied Serbia. Musalin landed on a chicken coop, sending birds scattering into the night. Master Sergeant Michael Rajacic came down in a tree and had to be helped to the ground. Navy Petty Officer Arthur Jabilian, the team's radio operator, drifted into a cornfield. They were met by Chetnik fighters and escorted to Mihailovic's headquarters at the village of Pranjani. What they found when they arrived almost defied the scope of what they had been told to expect. Gathered in and around the village, hidden in farmhouses and barns and the surrounding woodland, were hundreds of American airmen. They were young men from Ohio and California and Georgia and New York, men who weeks or months earlier had been flying combat missions at 30,000 feet and who were now living in a Serbian farming village, tended by people with whom they shared not a single word of language, waiting for something, anything, to change their circumstances. The first and most pressing task was the airfield. There was no suitable landing strip anywhere near Pranjani. What existed was a gently sloping meadow that might with considerable labor be made to approximate the conditions a C-47 transport aircraft required to land and depart under load. Serbian villagers, men, women, and children, worked to clear and level the ground. They removed boulders by hand. They filled depressions and smoothed the surface using whatever tools were available on farms in occupied territory. They did this work while German forces continued to operate in the region, and while the awareness of what discovery would mean sat over every person involved in the effort. The airmen themselves, those physically capable, joined the labor. The runway that emerged from this collective effort was primitive by any conventional measure. It was short, unlevel compared to any military airfield standard, and invisible on any Allied map. It was also, impossibly, functional. The first mass evacuation took place on the night of August 9th and into the early hours of August 10th, 1944. American C-47 transport aircraft, the same workhorse aircraft that had dropped paratroopers into Normandy just weeks before, came in low over the Serbian mountains, guided by bonfires lit along the edges of the improvised strip. One aircraft after another touched down, bounced across the uneven ground, slowed and turned. Airmen filed aboard in organized groups, 20 per aircraft, coordinated by Musalin and his team, moving in darkness and near silence, aware that the sound of aircraft engines at this hour in this valley could, if heard by the wrong people, bring consequences that none of them would survive. In a single night, more than 200 men were lifted out of occupied Yugoslavia and delivered to Allied territory in Italy. They arrived in Bari and Brindisi without a single aircraft lost, without a single crew member killed, and without, apparently, the German forces in the region ever understanding what had taken place above them. The operation continued through subsequent months, with additional evacuation flights pulling out more men as new airmen continued to come down over Yugoslav territory. By the time the last evacuation flight departed on December 27, 1944, over 500 Allied airmen, the bulk of them American, had been extracted from German-occupied Serbia through a combination of peasant generosity, guerrilla organization, OSS operational skill, and audacious aerial logistics. The Germans, for all their presence in the region, never discovered the Pranjani airstrip. Not one transport aircraft was lost. It was, by any measure applied to clandestine rescue operations, a complete operational success. the largest rescue of American airmen in the history of the war, and arguably in American military history to that point. What followed the rescue was, in its own way, as remarkable as the rescue itself, and considerably darker. General Mihailovich remained in Yugoslavia. He had been offered the chance to leave on the final flights and had declined each time, choosing to stay with his soldiers in a country that was now rapidly being absorbed by Tito's communist movement with Soviet backing. In 1946, he was captured by Tito's government, subjected to a trial his defenders regarded as a judicial performance rather than a proceeding, and executed. The United States government, navigating the delicate early architecture of what would become the Cold War, chose to say nothing publicly. The relationship with Yugoslavia's new communist government required management. The story of the rescue, the story of what Mihailovich's forces and the Serbian villagers had done for hundreds of American men, was classified. The Legion of Merit that President Truman awarded him posthumously, one of the United States military's highest honors available to foreign nationals, was kept secret by the State Department, not to be acknowledged publicly for years. When the rescued airmen returned home and attempted to speak about what they had experienced, about the people who had saved them, they found that the official machinery was not interested in the account they wished to give. The pilots did not stay silent. For decades, in veterans' halls and letters to congressmen and testimonies before informal committees, the men who had parachuted into Serbia and walked out of enemy territory alive pressed the case for the people who had made that possible. They organized, they lobbied, they returned to Serbia when they could, old men by then, walking back into the villages where young women had hidden them under floorboards and old men had given them the boots off their own feet. Some of the rescued airmen left their footwear behind before boarding the evacuation aircraft in 1944, a small gesture of reciprocity from men who had nothing else to give. The Serbian families kept those boots for generations. The story that official history preferred to leave in the classified archives was kept alive instead by the people it had actually happened to, by the pilots who had fallen from the sky and by the villagers who had caught them. There is a particular cruelty embedded in the way history chooses what it remembers and what it allows to fade. The men who returned from the mountains of Serbia came home to a country that was celebrating the end of a war, processing the enormity of what had been endured and won, and in no particular mood to complicate that celebration with inconvenient political nuance. They came home changed in ways that were difficult to articulate, grateful in a manner that exceeded the ordinary language of military gratitude, indebted to people who were, even as the airmen unpacked their bags and returned to civilian life, slipping beneath a new darkness. Yugoslavia was transforming. Tito's communist partisans had consolidated control over the country with Soviet backing, and the reckoning that followed for those who had served under the royalist banner was swift and often lethal. The Chetnik fighters who had guarded American airmen through the long months of 1944, who had moved them between villages in the middle of the night, who had stood watch while they slept, who had given up their own food in seasons when there was very little food to give, were now being denounced as traitors and collaborators. Some were imprisoned, some were beaten, some were killed. The word used against them was a particular historical indecency. They were called enemies of the people, the same people for whom they had sacrificed so much. Arthur Gibellion was working for the Veterans Administration in Washington when he opened a copy of the Washington Post one morning in 1946 and read a small item buried in the paper. The headline told him that Tito's forces had captured Mihailovich. Gibellion had parachuted into Serbia, had stood in the man's presence, had watched him organize and protect hundreds of American lives at personal and political cost that would have broken a lesser figure. He put down the paper and went to find the editor of the Post. He told him the story of what had happened in the mountains above Prognani, the airfield cleared by hand, the bonfires in the darkness, the aircraft lifting men out of occupied territory, one after another through the night. The editor listened. Word traveled. The rescued airmen, it turned out, had already been reaching out to one another, those young men from Ohio and Georgia and California who had come down through burning skies and been caught by strangers. They had organized. A 20-man delegation traveled to Washington. They mounted what they called a mission to save Mihailovich, meeting with politicians, submitting testimony, writing letters, granting interviews. None of it was enough. In July 1946, Mihailovich was executed by firing squad in Belgrade. He faced his executioners with a composure that those who witnessed it found difficult to explain. The airmen did not stop. For them, the execution did not resolve the debt, it deepened it. They lobbied for decades for formal American recognition of what Mihailovich's forces had done. They pushed for the Legion of Merit that President Truman had quietly awarded him to be made public, to be acknowledged rather than sealed in a diplomatic drawer for the convenience of Cold War relationship management. They testified before congressional committees. They returned to Serbia when they could, elderly men making pilgrimages to the farmhouses where they had once eaten stale bread and goat's milk on the floor, returning to the villages where they had waited in the dark, not knowing whether they would ever see their families again. In those villages, across the span of decades, the families of the people who had sheltered them had kept something, not just the memory, though the memory was kept too, passed from grandparent to grandchild with the seriousness reserved for things that must not be lost. They had kept the boots, the shoes left behind by airmen boarding the evacuation flights, small gestures of reciprocity from men who had nothing else to give, were preserved in homes across central Serbia for generations. They were not displayed, they were simply kept, the way people keep things that carry the weight of events too large to fit inside an ordinary frame. In 2004, a monument was dedicated at Prognani, on the ground where the improvised airstrip had been scratched into the earth 60 years earlier, on the field where the bonfires had burned and the C-47s had come in low over the tree line. American diplomats came, Serbian veterans came, old men by then, some of them the children and grandchildren of the Chetnik fighters who had stood guard through those long months. Surviving airmen came, men in their 80s and 90s, making one final journey back to a place that had remade them. They stood together on the same ground where the most audacious act of human generosity any of them had ever personally witnessed had taken place. And the Serbian press, for a few days at least, brought the story back into the light. In August of 2024, 80 years after the first evacuation flights lifted out of Prognani, an official ceremony was held at the site. The United States ambassador to Serbia stood on that ground and acknowledged in plain language what the historical record had for so long resisted acknowledging plainly, that ordinary people in an occupied country with nothing to gain and everything to lose had looked at young men fallen from the sky and chosen, without hesitation or calculation, to protect them. He called it something special. It was, in the way that only genuinely extraordinary things can be, also something simple. People in danger were helped by other people who decided that helping them was more important than their own safety. That decision was made not once by one person, but hundreds of times across dozens of villages over the course of many months under conditions of occupation that made the cost of that decision as high as any cost a civilian can be asked to pay. The aircraft that carried the rescued airmen back to Italy in the summer and autumn of 1944 returned those men to the world. They went on to live the long, ordinary lives that war had briefly placed in suspension. They married, raised children and grandchildren, grew old in the country they had flown to defend. but something in them had been permanently altered by what they had seen in the Serbian mountains, and the alteration did not fade the way most memories fade. It sharpened, if anything, with the passage of time and the accumulation of everything that followed. They had learned something that is difficult to learn from books or lectures, or even from most of what life ordinarily offers as instruction. They had learned what people are capable of when the question in front of them is not complicated by the fog of ideology, or the noise of politics, or the managed calculations of governments. When the question is simply whether to help or not to help. And the people being asked are farmers and shepherds and school teachers who have very little except the courage to answer it correctly.
History has a tendency to assign its honors to the large movements and the famous names, to the generals who commanded armies and the statesmen who signed documents. It is less comfortable with a different kind of record. The grandmother who hid a stranger under her floorboards, the farmer who slaughtered his last pig to feed men who could not speak his language, the child who carried a message through the dark at the instruction of adults who trusted that the child would not be stopped. Operation Halyard is remembered today imperfectly, incompletely, in ways that still do not fully match the scale of what it actually was, because the people it happened to refused to allow it to be forgotten. They spent the remainder of their lives insisting on the account. 500 men fell from the sky over occupied territory and walked out alive because strangers decided they would. That is, in the end, the whole of the story, and it is, in the end, enough. If this story meant something to you, hit like. It really helps. And tell me in the comments, do you think courage like this still exists today? Subscribe if you want more real stories that remind us what people are truly capable of. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.